go.
Right.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. We're incredibly excited about this. I know some of you. I am a political philosopher, and Mitch is an emergency manager and disaster planner who's been responding to the pandemic and has responded to many public health emergencies before this. And so what we're talking about today is in part our contribution to the volume on political theory. And it is also in part a book project that we've been working on throughout the pandemic on a social epistemology of disaster, of which a small part of that was published in the Kennedy Institute for Ethics Journal earlier this summer. So I'm gonna let Mitch jump us in and talk a little bit about the pandemic, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Go easy on me since I'm not a philosopher by training. Let's start with a story. So in April of 2020, the United States government sent a militarized hospital ship to New York City, if you remember. We're coming from an American context. A lot of our stories will be from that context. And they sent it at great expense and a lot of fanfare. We live in New York City. When the ship arrived, the sailors were greeted as heroes. It docked, and there were flags waving, and there was confetti, and there were fireworks. And in the end, the ship only treated 182 patients total at a time when New York City was treating 2,000 patients a day for COVID-19. The real work of the response was being done by local hospitals, local doctors. So the question is, why was so much effort put into a militarized response? At the same time, our president was saying that this virus was the worst attack we've ever had on our country, worse than Pearl Harbor, worse than the World Trade Center. There's never been an attack like this. I view this invisible enemy like a war. The militarized language was all over the disaster response. And the question is why? Why do we imbue our disaster response with the necessity of it being militarized? And our argument is that this is a deep strain in American thought and global thought, that we have a disaster imaginary that exists in our brains as a disciplinary tactic. It's an epistemological structure that underlies a lot of the policies and procedures that are used to respond to disasters. It's a way that we are taught to know disasters. And this disaster imaginary comes out in action movies, Wild West formulations, political rhetoric. When people talk about disasters, they speak of them as elements of chaos, as if we all in a disaster are suddenly forced into a Hobbesian state of nature where we're competing with each other. And only strong authoritarian leaders can stand up and lead us through that, through militarized tactics. Now, this is taught to us in all kinds of ways. In the American context, it's important, as Michelle Dauber wrote in her book, The Sympathetic State, that you can trace the entire social welfare contract in America back to disaster response. Starting from the Whiskey Rebellion just after the American Revolution, the United States Congress has given relief to those impacted by disasters, but not for other social welfare reasons. So a lot of people don't know this, but when Roosevelt's administration in the 1930s was arguing for the New Deal, the language they used was not about equality of access, not about everyone deserves a fair shake. It was the language of disaster response. Some of our citizens have been impacted by floods, have lost their jobs. We need to lift them back up into the social contract. And that means that built into the American welfare state is this argument about a chaotic disaster imaginary that we're always trying to keep people out of. And the way we do that is by using militarized means to sort of call them in. So the question is, why does this disaster imaginary exist under our political thinking? What purpose does it serve? And the reason that's an important question is because when you look at the sociology of disasters, the disaster imaginary, this militarized, chaotic disaster, has no bearing in sociology. Study after study of disasters have shown that people are going to share after disasters. They're going to work together. They're going to work towards solidarity. They're going to reach out to each other. militarized leadership is the least effective form of leadership in a disaster. And yet we come back to it over and over again. And our very imaginations, the way we imagine disasters, is disciplined so that we think that that's all right, when in fact it's ineffectual. Some kind of card game is being pulled there on us, and it's creating havoc on our social institutions, and it is causing a certain amount of rage and protest in the population. So Rachel Luft, as an example, has named this process racialized disaster patriarchy. That by leaning into these structures, we are using disasters and the disaster imaginary as a way to reinforce the most conservative, the most discriminatory or patriarchal forms of leadership in our disasters. Even when we as a society move towards more progressive means of government, in a disaster, we fall back. We are disciplined by our disaster imaginary to think that only leadership that is racialized, that leans on those impulses, that is patriarchal, that leans on authoritarian impulses, will save us. But there's another way, there's a better way to look at this per the sociology of disasters. The question is, how do we find that?
So Mitch has described the dominant story of this pandemic, at least as it's emerged in the US. But I want to note that, as right as he says, the brunt of New York City's response to COVID was not borne by the USS Comfort or the military officers aboard it. It has been overwhelmingly borne by women, right? It has been borne by essential workers, a majority of whom are women engaged in caregiving labor, a majority of whom are women of color. Of those who lost their jobs, particularly given how hard hit sectors like hospitality and the service industry have been, the majority to lose their jobs in the economic recession have been women. And the shuttering of schools and childcare has produced even more strains on women's labor, with a mass exit of women from the workforce. This summer, a survey found that 1 in 4 women were considering leaving the workforce or cutting back on work by September of 2020, with schools looking like they would not fully reopen. And in September 2020, the US workforce, and this has been echoed elsewhere across the globe, lost almost 1 million women altogether from the workforce. And again, this is echoed across the globe, and it also echoes patterns in previous pandemics, where the economic losses by men in pandemics are generally quickly recovered, and the economic losses by women in pandemics may last for decades. So, these effects, right, the labor of the disaster, primarily borne by women, have not been evenly distributed. Jessica Gross last week in the New York Times referred to women as the shock absorbers of our social and economic systems. Right, she said the more shocks there are, the more women are expected to absorb. And the pandemic, in some sense, if we look at the distribution of the labor of the pandemic, has been a shock absorbed by women, but absorbed unequally by women across the economic and global spectrum. What's new about this, right? That's not new. That has always been the case. It has always been the case that the social and economic shocks are borne by women because that is where our institutions are the weakest, which we'll talk more about. But what's new in a disaster, this is really what we want to hone in on, is that across the economic spectrum, even very wealthy women were expected to absorb the shock as institutions shuttered or failed around us. Because women at the bottom of this spectrum, of course, have been expected to absorb these shocks all along. So what's new is that this system of women as shock absorbers became visible, once again, to the privileged in a way that it had not been. The discriminatory impact of the essential labor designation, which is how we framed it in the United States, right? Essential laborers being those who work in hospitals and other medical and caregiving roles in public health, but also grocery store workers, sanitation workers, and in some cases, childcare workers, right? Essential laborers. This designation echoes the unsustainable outsourcing of pre-pandemic caregiving labor. Pre-pandemic caregiving labor has always in the United States, and I think in the UK as well, been organized through what sociologists have called care chains, which are privatized mechanisms through which the labor of care is outsourced locally or transnationally, often to support women remaining in the workforce. So privileged professional parents outsource their childcare and other domestic labor, and then the primarily women employed to take on that labor must themselves outsource their caregiving labor, creating a locally or globally racialized care drain that passes the vulnerability of caregiving down, even as it obscures the essential function of caregiving in our social, political, and economic systems. So in this framework, caregiving labor is designed to be precarious, underpaid, and largely invisible, and to reflect the invisibility of those who perform it. And this is not just a gendered invisibility, it is also through care chains, a racialized invisibility. And this, of course, functions, as it always has, to maintain the illusion of independence that grounds our conception of autonomous personhood, right, and independent citizens, and to enforce the devaluation of this reproductive labor. And our legal ideas of caregiving tend to do this too. They tend to obscure the role, not just the role of, but actually the existence of paid non-parental caregivers, further obscuring the ways in which we privatize and outsource various forms of domestic labor. So the practice devaluation of this labor produces care chains that inevitably snapped as COVID stretches across the globe. As a result, the pandemic has disproportionately impacted women, especially women of color across the globe. And we know from previous pandemics that this impact may last decades, shaping the economic possibilities of a generation. But characteristically, this has not produced greater solidarity among the primarily women who are bearing the brunt of this strain. Instead, our learned dependence on the economic exploitation of care chains has simply reproduced itself through the pandemic in new forms. So part of what we're arguing is that in late capitalism, we are practiced in patriarchal patterns of orienting solidarity and support away from those who perform the labor of care that we outsource. And in a disaster, in a pandemic, where the labor of care becomes a critical feature of disaster response, that practiced patriarchal neglect goes on steroids, right? It becomes part of the state logics of response. So in COVID-19, we have patterned our disaster response itself on these privatized care chains. We've normatively recast them through the lens of essential workers, ensuring that the vulnerabilities of caregiving elaborate downstream, that we pass them down through the gendered and racialized patterns of our care chains. In the pandemic, building response structures that surge existing networks of caregiving, right? Expanding hospitals and expanding other parts of our public health supply chain has produced what Mitch called racialized disaster patriarchy, right? It has put women back in the home. It has placed unequal strains on communities of color, and in particular on the labor of women of color. By producing derivative vulnerability in this way, pandemic response relies on the structured invisibility of caring labor to disrupt the emergence of disaster solidarity. Reorienting pandemic response, therefore, is going to require what we're thinking of as a resistant care ethics that centers on the conditions of caregiving and vulnerability in disaster, and that rewrites that disaster imaginary that Mitch is talking about in a way that reshapes public discourse and policy, and that mobilizes our natural inclination towards solidarity that emerges in disasters, and does that through our care chains, rather than allowing our care chains to reproduce the invisibility of that labor.
So to pick up on what Jordan is saying, we have this structure where certain things are made invisible to us. The disaster imaginary is there to sort of discipline us to think about these things in a certain way. And that leads to this racialized disaster patriarchy. Now the secret that's at the heart of this is that suddenly in a disaster like COVID, these structures become visible. Even for the privileged, you cannot escape the fact that elements of this system are not working. They are causing you pain, your family pain, your loved ones pain. And that shift in perception after disaster, we call natality. In this natality phase after disaster, suddenly you are open to new ideas and new conceptions because suddenly some of the problems with the system that were previously invisible to you are now visible. And this is when we sort of can turn to the story of Black Lives Matter. So by late May 2020 in the United States, it was very clear that the impact of the pandemic, as Jordan said, was both race and gendered. That those who were most marginalized in American society, especially those who were Black folk living in poverty, were bearing a much higher portion of the mortality than the population as a whole. And that sat there and was realized by that community and others around the country. And it created anger and frustration. But unlike in other disasters, a hurricane, a coastal storm, where you could be in solidarity with others, right? Because you were all evacuating together, you were in a shelter, you were marching, people were being kept in isolation. So what you had was something of a powder keg of emotion, where people were realizing the systemic issues that they were living in, but their imaginations were sort of telling them it wasn't really happening. And yet their lived experience, their natality, was walking them through this process of learning. And on top of that, on May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was killed by a police officer. And it ended up sparking the largest global protest movement in history based on the data that we have now. And what we want to argue is part of that is the death of George Floyd is tragic and unfair and is worth protesting. But it also captured this unique moment of instability that was happening because of COVID and because of the realization of the underlying systemic problems that the community was going to. It became a cultural watershed because the pandemic had systematically exposed the racism built into our social system and the readiness with which our institutions and leadership had been willing to declare some people acceptable sacrifices. So if you look at the structures for care ethics that Jordan laid out, right, there's a model in there of saying our response will work in a militarized way as long as we let some people, essential workers, other people providing care, lower on the totem pole, often women, women of color, as long as they are willing to sacrifice and absorb the shocks. The protests that followed George Floyd were shaped by our orientation towards solidarity in disaster and our collective frustration that we were not allowed to exercise that solidarity because we were being disciplined away from it, right? We knew that essential workers were dying and being hurt on our behalf. Our solidarity as humans was working against that. But both our underlying epistemological frameworks, the way that we were being taught to understand disasters, and the decisions of the political leadership were disciplining us that it had to be that way, that the sacrifices themselves were acceptable. It's a complicated point, so let me try and tease it out a little bit. By anchoring this collective shift in perspective that I called natality. So when in a disaster, you suddenly realize how the structures of power are working. Remember, I called that natality. Now, this signals a new epistemic openness. So people that before were certain that political systems were working for them and supporting them, suddenly will question that when they see the failures of a pandemic response. That questioning leads to a greater epistemic openness where people are more liable to question the ways of knowing that they're taught. And that leads to new alliances and new coalitions. So when we saw these large marches happening after George Floyd's death, these protests that grew larger and larger and larger, what we were seeing were people whose minds had been reshaped by their experience of COVID. And that reshaping allowed them to ally with the Black Lives Matter protests and organizers because they were showing a key new vision of the future. Now, at the beginning of this, I talked about the disaster imaginary and what the point of the disaster imaginary was and why it is so built into us in our institutions. And just to remind you, right, politically, the militarized disaster response, the state of nature chaos, is built into all American disaster response legislation. The Stafford Act, the welfare system, all sort of say that in a disaster, you are impacted, you are put into chaos. Our job is to remove you from that chaos and put you exactly where you were before in the social contract. So it's income-based. You have a $200,000 house, maybe we'll help you rebuild that house. You live in a $25,000 apartment, we'll help you get into that apartment. But it doesn't have an underlying human rights framework, which is something at the United Nations level and in other places. In a disaster, you're trying to restore everyone based on a conception of underlying human dignity. Right? Everybody has dignity, everybody should be elevated. The United States disaster response contract does not have that. It is built on this Hobbesian framework of just getting you back to where you were before. So the point of that is this disaster imaginary that we are disciplined for is there to foreclose this epistemic openness after a disaster. It's there to kind of shut it down in our conception, because after disaster, our openness and solidarity towards other humans leads us to want to see greater solidarity in political systems writ large. And if that is not impeded, we will work towards that solidarity, and that will lead to culture change. So there must be a disaster imaginary in place to discipline us, right? To keep us from moving towards that new vision in order for the current system to stay in place, in order to sort of keep that culture change from happening. So the disaster imaginary has that disciplinary function. That's why you always hear return to normalcy, build back better. Let's get things back the way they were before. Our disaster response frameworks are conservative. They look backwards. They do not look forwards, because they're designed to keep the existing systems in place. And the reason that that works is because, as Mills reminds us, social contracts, the social contracts that we rely on, are at base epistemological contracts. They rely on certain agreed on ways of knowing. And as long as we accept those ways of knowing, even if we try to change the laws, change the rules, change the structures, it won't work, because our imaginations keep bringing us back. And that's what the disaster imaginary is designed to do, is to bring us back to this conservative framework. And that's one reason, if you look at Black Lives Matter protests, you had early things, maybe you saw them in the global news. The city of Minneapolis worked to defund the police department. New York City defunded its police department. People were calling for broader changes in law enforcement. And at this moment in history, those have hit substantial policy walls, because even though legislatures have opted to try and change rules or regulations, this return to normalcy push that's embedded in our disaster imaginary is working against that. It's calling us back to the way things were before, and those things have stalled out. The question is why? What is there that is so resistant to the change that our new solidarity is moving us towards?
Right. So I want to argue that this story that Mitch is telling is a story about resilience, right? Disaster managers love to talk about resilience, right? Resilience being the capacity that a system has to bounce back after a stress or a strain, to absorb those shocks and keep going. And it's worth reminding ourselves that there are two broad forms of resilience that are used in emergency manager literature. One of them is like the resilience of a bridge, right? That can just absorb the earthquake and look exactly like it did before. And then there's the resilience of, say, a forest, which can burn down and grow back, right? Adapting in new ways to its circumstance, right? But in either case, it is this ability to bounce back. Now, Christy Dotson has argued that understanding the resilience of our political and institutional systems requires us to examine the epistemological systems that makes them resilient. And I take this to be an argument very closely aligned with Charles Mills's account of the epistemological contract that undergirds the social contract. So a resilient epistemological system, Dotson argues, is a set of collective epistemic resources and practices through which we reproduce shared knowledge about the world. So an epistemological system is resilient when it can absorb shocks and strains, reforming and refining itself at the site of rupture, so that we can know in the same ways, even as the world changes around us. Disasters are fundamentally tests of resilience. They test not just our political and our institutional structures, but as we've argued, our epistemological ones too. As our worlds are shaken and we encounter our own vulnerability, right, our embodied, our economic, our environmental vulnerability, we perceive the world in new ways. We perceive ourselves as vulnerable. We perceive ourselves as interconnected with others. We may perceive the brittleness and the failures of our institutional order as they fail to rise to the challenge of disaster. And we may also perceive the possibility of mutual aid and new forms of coalition and solidarity. This epistemic openness that Mitch is describing, right, shaped by the natality of disaster, has the capacity to make our resilient epistemological systems visible to us as systems. In other words, as enclosed and constructed ways of knowing. So as an example of this, Brianna Toole has argued that white supremacy is a classic example of a resilient epistemological system. It's one that adapts and reforms itself and reproduces the epistemic exclusion that makes it work as like an epistemic toolkit for white people, right? The pandemic, with its highly visibly raced impacts, has strained that system. It has strained the system of white supremacy, even as it has strained our economic system, our school system, our health system. And by straining it, it has made it visible to us as a system, right? So that the global spread of the George Floyd protests is a shared articulation of the limits of that now visible system. Now, the George Floyd protests were shaped through the movement for Black Lives, which is articulated first by Black queer feminist activists Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors after the death of Trayvon Martin, and coalesces as a broader movement through the protests in Ferguson after the death of Michael Brown in 2014. The transformational power of these protests, of this summer's protests, hinged on the thoroughly imagined, carefully constructed, lovingly held aspirational vision of the architects of the moment, namely these Black, feminist, queer, trans-informed movement for Black lives. The organizers and theorists of this movement focused newly widespread rage about the failures of the state and police violence through a coherent and carefully argued call to abolish police and prisons, reframed white supremacist state violence as a public health problem operating through coronavirus, and drew on Black feminist reproductive justice frameworks to envision radical transformations in community services, education, and economics. So in the face of an institutional and political infrastructure that seemed incapable of coherent planning or response in the face of an unprecedented global crisis, the movement for Black Lives articulated this global crisis as a feature of, rather than a rupture of, our normal systems. And in doing so, it offered a transformative vision of justice that shaped engaged collective action and transformed our emergent disaster solidarity into a shared vision of the future that produced new coalitions calling for change. So part of what we want to argue here is that we should understand the movement for Black Lives as a project of disaster response and as a call for what Alexis Shotwell has called aspirational solidarity, or a form of solidarity that imagines alternate futures by mapping the normal order of things as already untenable and apocalyptic. Now, it's worth noting that the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement has its roots in organizing in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And so it is a disaster response movement in more ways than one. organizers rooted in the Black liberation movement, organizers, for example, grounded in the Black Panthers of Louisiana, created grassroots responses after Katrina, like the People's Hurricane Relief Fund and Common Ground. And Rachel Luft has shown in her analysis of these organizations how they recontextualized threat, hazard, and trauma in the daily conditions faced by disenfranchised groups in New Orleans in order to understand disaster, to understand the hurricane as being, in a sense, different in degree rather than in kind from the ongoing experience of social inequality for many in the United States. And an example of this is that some of the organizations, some of these sort of second generation organizations that emerged in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina were Black feminist reproductive justice organizations run by Black women, designed to produce ongoing forms of care and community organizing, designed to meet community needs in the wake of the government's disastrous response to Katrina, that in fact produced emergent networks of mutual aid and caregiving when Hurricane Gustav hit 2 years later. So I want to argue that the care drain of the current disaster is an example of the kind of this vision that disasters are the institutional failure of disasters are a feature of rather than a rupture of our established institutional order. The impact of the pandemic is designed under our current system to be absorbed not by those military doctors on the USS Comfort in their fancy uniforms with the fireworks, but by essential workers, largely women of color, who provide care while grappling with the care drain that disaster, both the emergent disaster of the pandemic and the ongoing disaster of poverty and racialized patriarchy, produces in their own families and communities. So as a Black feminist intervention, the Movement for Black Lives insists on an alternate set of epistemic practices in disaster, and in doing so, it calls into being an emergent, an alternate disaster imaginary. Now, I know we're coming to the end of our time, so I just want to offer a few ways that we are thinking about Black Lives Matter as a Black feminist vision of alternate futures that we think has the capacity to ground what we're calling a resistant care ethic. So a care ethics that operates in resistance to the care drain rather than in alignment with it. So one example of this is that the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the many community organizing efforts that it draws from is the reproductive justice movement, which was formed in 1994 by a group of 12 Black women who were dissatisfied with the reproductive rights framework in the United States, right? Which was the framework that argued for the right to abortion and the right to contraception as being at the center of our story about women's embodied freedom. Reproductive justice is the argument that, in fact, what a vision for women's liberation must include is an account of the conditions that make caregiving possible, broadly construed. Right, so an alternate vision for the future that thinks about what it means to be able to give care, to do the labor of care, and to respect the agency of caregivers. And you'll notice that this is not necessarily simply about mothering or parenting, but about the labor of care more broadly, particularly as that labor of care, again, disproportionately falls socially, politically, economically on the shoulders of women of color on a global scale. Now, in making this argument, I'm borrowing from Alexis Shotwell's account of aspirational justice, where reproductive justice is one of the primary examples she gives of an aspirational solidarity framework. For Shotwell, aspirational solidarity is a form of solidarity that emerges when we agree on a shared vision of the future. And that agreement, right, the coalitions we build around a shared vision for the future are grounded in an awareness that the institutional and epistemic order in which we currently stand has already failed us. Right, that the future is necessary. It is a necessary remedy for the failures of the systems in which we are embedded, and that our ability to identify visions of the future that we can share is critical to the possibility of building new social movements. So what Mitch and I are really arguing is that part of what a disaster like the pandemic does, and this is an unprecedented disaster on a global scale that has produced, we're arguing, an unprecedented epistemic shift, an unprecedented collective awareness that our institutional order is already broken, that it is already failing us. What that does is it makes possible new coalitions of aspirational solidarity. And that the Black Lives Matter protests are an example of that move towards aspirational solidarity. That what Black Lives Matter offered, what the movement for Black Lives offered, was a coherent, lovingly held vision of an alternate future, and that people who were desperate to envision a future that was not organized through our already broken institutional orders felt called to that vision in a way that they had not been before. But part of what I am also arguing in this is that the raced and gendered logic of the care drain, the ways that we are practiced in using care chains to outsource our own domestic and caregiving labor, that is a practice of breaking with the possibilities of aspirational solidarity. The care drain orients us away from solidarity with, in particular, women more marginalized than we are. In other words, I am arguing that this is a feminist problem of solidarity, and one that the disaster solidarity called into being by the movement for Black Lives, I think, offers a possible remedy for. And so if there is hope in this global pandemic, I think it may be in this, this collective call towards a Black feminist alternate vision for the future through the pandemic. So I think we'll leave it there, and we'll open it for questions.
Thank you very much. There is a kind of button here where people can show their reactions. So there you are. You have to put your screens on for your reactions to show those. So people want to do that. Right. So questions now. Then, if there are two ways of question. If you we can have a look at, maybe Garmin can get a view of everybody. So if you want to ask a question, put your mic on and also wave.
Hello, I've got my mic on.
Oh, there's Alyssa. Yeah, go on then, Alyssa. You go ahead, and then Garmin will look for the next one.
I thought this was really insightful and really thought-provoking. And one of the thoughts that it has provoked is the question whether the possible remedy, excuse me, offered by Black Lives Matter to the issues which Jordan has characterized as an issue of feminism, of solidarity, which is an issue for the feminist movement, but also for all of us because of the failures of the existing systems, epistemological and social, whether this possible remedy can operate on a global level. Now, of course, we do have evidence that there was some degree of global solidarity with regard to the Black Lives Matter movement, but my impression is, if I understood the talks that you both have given, or their joint talk, your attention was focused mainly on the United States. So maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah.
Flip a coin for it?
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, we have been focused on the United States, and I want to be clear that part of the reason that we've focused our analysis in that way, I mean, it is partly that we're writing from an American context, but we are really interested in the question of how our conception of disaster has become an American product for export. So that, like, part of our larger project is certainly to think globally about how disasters are conceptualized. But a good example of this is that when various countries around the world in 2007, 2008, and 2009 wrote pandemic ethics plans, one of the things that emerged in places like New Zealand and Canada was when pandemic ethicists were writing their plans and sort of saying, these are the values for a pandemic response. Several of them included solidarity as a key ethical value for pandemic response. And in the United States, like, for example, the state of North Carolina was given this guidance to adapt for their state. And their answer was, well, we can't possibly include solidarity because that is un-American. That is an un-American value, and it cannot be part of an American pandemic plan. And accordingly, the CDC's 2009 pandemic ethics guidance, which has sort of been the playbook for this response, has not included values of solidarity. And in fact, said nothing about caregiving, said nothing about school closures, said nothing about the possible gendered impacts of the pandemic. So part of the reason for this focus is very much on this question of how does the American disaster imaginary come to operate as a global cultural, economic, and political export that is shaping disaster response around the world. Although we're also, we think, seeing some interesting alternate models.
Yeah, and so it's important to note that one thing that's important to see globally, if you look at the sort of ranking of how well countries have done, there's a lot of focus on New Zealand, but the sort of number 2 country in terms of handling COVID-19 globally is Senegal. And because Senegal used to be a colonial state, it is bringing this idea of resistant ethics, as Jordan laid out, into its COVID response. So Senegal, for example, mandated 24-hour test results for COVID. And in June, they hit that model. That's as long. They did mandatory masking in April. And they've done direct sort of cash support to people to keep the economy going. And the reason that they've done all of these things, they've done case management at home. So if you're sick in Senegal, instead of going to a hospital, they'll send you a caseworker so that you can recover in your own space. These things together have been explicitly based on a solidarity framework and explicitly based on a resistant to colonial impetus sort of framework, right? So they're explicitly rejecting these kind of Western colonialist ethics in their work. And that's really the global model. If you can reset the imaginary, and ex-colonial states are the experts in having to sort of reset their imaginary in a resistant way, it will make your response much more effective from a solidarity standpoint.
Yeah, because and we didn't get into this here, but that's another piece of our analysis of the idea of the disaster imaginary, is to really clearly situate it as a form of settler colonialism, so that disasters are used to reinforce settler colonial logics. And part of what this means is that other states around the world who also have imaginaries of settler colonialism to draw on like Australia, for example, will tend to find this American disaster imaginary very sensical, right? It will map onto the structures in place. And so one of the things that we are interested in is how, as disasters become more and more common and begin to happen more and more often on a global scale like this one, this functions as a kind of reinforcement of settler colonial logics through things like the global economic supply chain. Now, I realize that didn't answer the question about sort of the problem of feminist solidarity, but I'm hoping that it helps to show why it is that we think analyzing disasters in this particularly American context is useful to understanding how response plays out across the globe. As for the solidarity question, I mean, I think that I don't know that I have a good answer to that one at this time. I'm going to be totally honest. I don't know that have we gotten as far as
exporting the aspirational visions globally. We have not yet figured out how to export the aspirational visions globally.
But,
Pandemic's still going on. It's early.
well, but part of that is that we think that aspirational visions need to be local. That part of the problem, right, is that this idea that like disaster response can look the same everywhere is itself a form of colonial logic. And that part of what we're really interested in the way that Black Lives Matter has emerged, particularly in different cities across the US, is how embedded it is in local knowledges. And so part of what a decolonial global disaster response model would need to look like is it would need to have an epistemological framework that prioritized local knowledges and the emergence of aspirational solidarities that mapped onto the particular constructions of racialized disaster patriarchy in each location.
Shall we go on to a second question? I'd like to say just briefly that to me, it mapped on incredibly to the British experience. But I mean, other people raise questions. Garmon, who's next?
Yeah, so the next is Alice, and then it's Sylvia.
Alice?
Thank you very much for the talk. It was fascinating. Really nice. And I love the way you guys presented together. It's really cool. Okay, my question's about what you said about agreement. So you said there has to be an agreement about a vision of the future. So here's my question. So I wanted to hear more concrete or particulars about that agreement. So who is it who agrees? So who agrees? And how can that agreement bring about change in a system that is, of course, fighting to be kept in place? So how does that logic
so you know, in our model, we are trying to use something like an ecological model for epistemological frameworks, where you're in this really sort of rich environment. And we think of something like a watershed. And a watershed is a human-made set of structures that are meant to control the energy in an ecological system. And similarly, an epistemological system is like that, right? It's sort of trying to control the ways of knowing. And so imagine within that framework, you have sort of a flood, and you have the work of things in the watershed like seawalls that are kind of fighting against it. And so the lines work like this. First, in this natality phase after disaster, it is sort of amoral. Like, you're open to new ideas, but those ideas could be aspirational or they could be nostalgic. In COVID, we didn't just see people in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. We saw white supremacists coming with AR-15s, right? We saw people that were using this to really enforce white supremacy. So natality breeds all of this, and some of it is destructive and some of it is helpful. So in the framework that Dotson lays out, there are kind of three disaster standpoints that we are using to talk about whether you will change a resilient epistemic system or not. There are those folks who are within the epistemic system deeply, right? The people that are running the disaster response, the elites in the society. And then on the other side, you have the folks who are the organizers, who understood before the disaster that the system was untenable, as Jordan was laying out. But then in the middle, you have the questioners, the people that have the biggest perceptual shift after the disaster, that suddenly wake up and look around and say, oh, wow, maybe this isn't working. And so the game of changing it is sort of how many of those questioners will move towards the aspirational vision that the marginalized folks are presenting, because they have the expertise in futuring, right? They've been trying to move us towards the future for a long time, right? The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. They're the people trying to bend us there. But then the elites, the people deep within the epistemic system, they own the disaster imaginary. And their job is to call these questioners back into the fold and make sure they don't change things too much. And so to your question, what you need is for the aspirational vision to pull enough of the energy of these questioners into itself, and for the resilient system to have been weakened enough by the disaster that it can sort of crack, and that the aspirational vision can lead towards real change in how people know.
Yeah, and that is why for us this problem of the structure of the care chain is so important, because of the way in which it gives like, for example, in this disaster, which has impacted women disproportionately, even the most successful women, and I mean it has impacted parents more generally, but the impact globally has been highly gendered. Because of the ways in which particularly privileged white women have bought into this logic of the care drain, right, of privatizing and outsourcing that labor, it breaks those possibilities for aspirational solidarity. And we see that, for example, in some of the ways that we have talked in the United States, especially about childcare and about schools, the ways that parents are pitted against the interests of teachers rather than thinking in solidarity with them, for example.
Yeah, Sylvia next, I think.
Sylvie?
Can you hear me?
Yes, you can.
Well, it's mostly a comment rather than a question, so you can skip it because I'm a little bit anxious about the time. I would want other people to have a chance to say something too. I listened to your presentation with great interest, and I think that most of the people here would agree with your analysis. But as far as I could tell, you're mostly presenting conclusions rather than hypothesis. And because you said that that's a philosophical analysis, I was curious about the foundations or the philosophical framework which motivates your investigation. And I detected two themes, and I think that you should drop one of them because it gets too much and it makes it hard to follow. And the first theme is basically you're bringing philosophy and sociology together with some elements of late capitalism. So that sounds very much like Frankfurt School critical theory type of analysis to me. Then you mentioned briefly exploitation and patriarchy. That's a little bit of a Marxist language, but you know, exploitation requires a background of a theory of capital, and I don't think that you have enough material for that. So I would simply leave it out. You can basically say, okay, we work with this kind of latent critical theory sort of framework. I would leave exploitation and patriarchy out. And then you have a third theme, which I think is the most interesting and captures what you actually want to say, which is vulnerability, solidarity through the concept of labor. And that's what you're really talking about, I think. And finally, one last comment about the state of nature. I'm very much into Hobbes. And I don't think that you should be using the concept of a state of nature here. Why? Because the problem with the state of nature is human-made. Whereas what you're talking about, the disaster that you're talking about, which involves the deconstruction of a pre-existing structure, is more properly described with the concept of hollow fires in social theory, when all of a sudden a structure breaks down. And that breakdown is caused by a non-human agency. So that is my comment.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We didn't ground this very well in the talk, but part of what we're responding to is the philosopher Naomi Zak has written a book on disaster ethics that is one of the few books in philosophy that has successfully really crossed over into emergency management. And she uses the idea of the second state of nature to ground her analysis of disaster ethics. And so part of what we're trying to do is pull on the places where the ways that philosophers have already framed disasters in this kind of cross-disciplinary conversation. And so I take all of that, absolutely. But I just wanted to ground that is part of where we are locating the work that we're doing.
Let me just, on the disaster front, in terms of the sociology, in terms of the last piece you said about the second state of nature versus the, was it Holyoke fire? I don't know that idea in political theory. But you were saying a structure broke from
an fire. Sorry, that's my accent.
Oh, like Oh, sorry. All right, well, let me just, the broad point is, from a disaster theory standpoint, a number of thinkers in this area, sociologists and other kinds of critical theorists in disasters, have argued really succinctly and well that disasters are not actually natural, right? They shouldn't be thought of as acts of God or from an external perspective. A hotel fire is actually a great example. Think of something like Katrina. You imagine a Hurricane Katrina as an external force that is hitting a city. From a disaster vulnerability standpoint, the way we see it is the city, if you have a city like Katrina with low-lying housing that is not where, if you have a city like New Orleans with low-lying housing where the buildings are not well made and people don't have structures, the disaster has already happened. It's just waiting for the hurricane to come and sort of bring it to be. So although the natural hazard is itself natural, an act of God, if you will, the impact on humans is created by humans because of the structures that they've put in place, whether those structures are inappropriate building codes or whether those structures are healthcare systems that are degraded and can't provide appropriate care. So it's important to distinguish between the hazard and the force it brings and the human impact, which is generally created by the human structures that exist, even more so than the impact of the disease itself. And one way you can see that in COVID is the way different countries have seen it so well. Same virus, vastly different impacts because of the underlying human structures that are impacted in every place.
Next question, I think, is Hugh Williams, and then it's David Sullivan afterwards.
Okay, thank you very much. Really fascinating and provocative talk. And as Howard mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot in what you were saying that can be applied in some ways to the context here in the UK. In particular, I think that idea of invoking the war spirit has kind of been tacked on as well to the prevailing kind of right-wing patriotic nationalist politics that is conditioning a lot of the response of the moment here in the UK. Also, likewise, in terms of the pushback, if you like, Black Lives Matter has obviously had a big impact here in terms of protest, and that's kind of been articulated largely by this critique of obviously the British colonial history. So like a local example of this was the taking down of statue of Thomas Picton, who carried out all sorts of horrendous crimes in the name of empire. So I think in terms of that global applicability that you're thinking about, certainly some of the experiences we've had here in the UK would certainly buttress those arguments. I just wanted to raise a query, perhaps it's more of a comment, that maybe ties in with some of what Sylvie was getting at in terms of the context or the potential wider context then for the analysis you're putting forward. Because it was very difficult for me not to think about Nancy Fraser's short essay, The Old is Dying but the New Cannot Be Born, in terms of some of these motifs that you're speaking to here. In particular, this idea of the sort of Gramscian crisis, if you like, where, the hegemony has been shattered, that you have that disjuncture between, as it were, the masses and the political classes. And that in that context, the pandemic is a sort of continuation and deepening of this ongoing crisis. And in particular, what brought that to mind was the way you were discussing, the potential for solidarity, because obviously both in terms of Fraser's analysis, but also Gramsci's analysis, there's this idea of sort of subaltern groups, if you like, or identity groups in more contemporary thinking, I suppose. There's this idea of them allying and bringing a form of solidarity together to form this kind of or this counter-hegemonic bloc, if you like. And so, I felt that your analysis in many ways kind of fitted within that context. I don't know if that's a helpful comment or it's something that you've actually been conscious of as you developed the work. But I think in particular that notion of the disaster imagery that kind of closes down the possibility of us, building that solidarity is really evocative. And I can see exactly how it's working in the UK context, where again, you invoke the British war spirit, as it were, to sort of try and clamp down on some of these new, more radical forms of politics that are actually emerging here. And I guess when you were talking about the K drain, and obviously you have the military industrial complex in the background right there with the kind of big warship landing in New York, whether that sort of wider context of the crisis of capitalism is something again that can help you link the analysis you're providing to the wider global context. Sorry, that's a few garbled thoughts. I'm not sure if it amounts to a question, but yeah, that's what sprung to mind when I was listening to the analysis. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And Nancy Fraser is definitely someone that we've used in some of the ways that we're thinking about this. So yeah, thank you. And I think the thing that I would just add to all of this is that the thing that as far as we know that we're doing that is new, because I know that there is a lot of analysis, particularly at the level of political theory on this, is really trying to ground this in the sort of emergent tradition of feminist epistemology. And so trying to use the tools that have been developed in particular by Linda Alcoff, Christy Dotson, Brianna Toole, right? Like there's a whole large school doing this work on thinking about, Miranda Fricker, theorizing how oppression produces practices of knowledge. And so that's a huge part of the framework that we're drawing on, that as far as we know has not been applied to disaster theory before. And so that is part of the new terrain that we're trying to carve out with this project. So, but we really, really appreciate both of your comments in terms of thinking about what work we might lean on in thinking about this. Yeah, just to add, this very interesting. I was going to ask whether that was Christy Dotson that you have been talking about, and her work and Miranda Fricker's is, I can see why you were able to use it in such constructive ways.
David?
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for the paper. Very illuminating, I thought, and very thought-provoking. I have two comments, really. One is about the idea of the military, this idea of the kind of militarization or the military metaphor, which obviously is very, as Hugh was saying, is very prevalent in Britain. What occurred to me about that was that in America, and this is obviously a British person looking at an American situation, is that there seem to be two approaches, certainly by people like Donald Trump. On the one hand, there's very much this idea of the military, the enemy, that is almost is intelligent and knows what it's doing, is on sort of hazard strategy and so on. But then there's the idea that actually this isn't really a problem at all, and that seems to be something that Trump has often suggested. He's in denial about the reality of the problem, and I wondered whether that reflected a confusion in the kind of dominant ideology, if you like, or the dominant perception or the dominant way of trying to control people. And maybe that's a way forward in a sense, to show that the dominant thinking about the government and so on is actually very confused, and maybe that's one thing. The other thing I thought about more philosophically was I'm very interested in your shifts in perception and the comment about natality and so on, and about the structures become visible. And as you were talking, I was thinking about John Stuart Mill, who says some very similar things. And actually some of the things you say almost seem to be a kind of reflection of Mill's argument. I'm sure they're not, but and I wondered to what extent, going back to an earlier point about the kind of philosophical connections and epistemology and so on, whether you think these shifts in perception arise over at various points in history of Western, or history of the world really, but history of philosophy, history of political thought, and that they arise from different reasons. So at the moment they arise for the reasons you give, but otherwise, in other times, for example, in Mill's case, they arise because you talked about the political upheaval of mid-Victorian England and the move towards political reform and so on. So I just wondered whether you thought I suppose my question really is whether the epistemological argument is really a more general one about the idea of structures becoming visible and so on, and whether that could be linked in more generally to what you're saying. Sorry, it's a bit not very clear, but these are my responses to what you were saying.
Well, thank you for that, David. I actually feel like I can maybe answer both questions a little bit in one by saying that part of what we're we are thinking about is the way in which disaster, recurrent, normalized, normative disaster, is working in some of the same ways in the 21st century and the late 20th century that colonialism worked to organize our social, economic, political, and epistemological systems for most of the prior centuries. So that part of what we're looking at is how is disaster sort of picking up the work of colonialism, echoing the work of colonialism. And so part of the way that colonialism operated was through this rhythmic sort of the invisibility of colonial conflict and then the visibility of it when it served to bolster the existing regime, right? So that pattern of, on the one hand, saying this is a war, we must win the war, and on the other hand saying it's not a problem at all, that is an echo, right, of the strategies of colonial and imperial states. And so that is one of the ways that I think we're interested in thinking about disaster, again, more broadly, as a central agent of social, institutional, economic, and epistemological change that is sort of reshaping the new world order.
And the other, I think, thing to hit is the hyper-localized nature of it. Perceptual shift we're talking about is so fast in a disaster and so local. You wake up and your house has been destroyed, right? You wake up and your parents have died. And so it is fast, and it is sometimes very short-lived as well. And so we're trying to think of how to use that perceptual shift, which in disasters is time delimited. There are the global implications, but there's also the implications of an individual person. How long does that shift last? And how do you sort of use that shift in these broader social change constructs?
Right. Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Yeah. I think Brooke actually has a comment, does she? If she's
oh gosh, I typed it out because I thought for sure we would never get all the way to my comment. So quickly, I am neither an expert. I want to compare to, I think it strengthens your point, but you might want to compare why Senegal is doing well to why Mongolia is doing well, because I believe they are both doing well, but differently so. That's just a comment. You use Senegal as an example. And the other question that I have to help in this conversation about how to decenter the US centricity of your argument, which I understand you not to be, in general, you don't seem to be wanting to center it and yet you do seem to recognize that we are at a moment when the US is central in perpetuating global epistemic structures of power. So I see the tension there. But one of the risks I see in your account is that it renders invisible by focusing on Black Lives Matter, which is absolutely a great example of this. I think it renders invisible just how much work has been done in other solidarity movements globally for the past decades in trying to reach out to each other. I think their talk is fabulous, and it's really giving us a lot of great understandings, but I think there's a way to talk about the moment and what's possible here in the way that one of you did in your part of the talk that doesn't also render invisible, but rather helps render visible why these other forms of solidarity were invisible. And the examples I might think of are global women's movements that were indeed, as you're pointing out, incredibly locally based and yet well networked. I'm thinking of the movement to recognize domestic workers' work, and that was successful at getting that recognized at the ILO. And the movement right now to generation equality, which is absolutely networking together through feminism, indigenous groups, migrant groups, anti-globalization groups. So is there a way that the argument would be strengthened by emphasizing the epistemological opening or opportunity change in the opportunity structure that you're highlighting in a way that doesn't require us to render invisible all the work that has been going on, but hasn't been visible because we haven't been at a comparable epistemic moment?
Yeah,
that's
that is really, really helpful, Brooke. Thank you so much for that. And yes, I think there is, and that is part of the research that we've been doing that we didn't get to here, is again looking at doing an analysis of, for example, pandemic planning in countries around the world to look at what kinds of ethical guidance emerged. And a really good example of that is actually in New Zealand. Their pandemic ethical guidance was developed in conversation with local Maori community organizers, and and has an explicit use of sort of Maori frameworks for thinking about mutual aid as part of the national pandemic plan. And so that's one of the things we've been looking at is not just where. I think we need to look more broadly at the kinds of coalition building that you're talking about. What we have been tracking is where local movements of resistance have informed planning guidance, since that's part of what we're interested in, is this question of, like, where do we see practices of disaster response emerging that are informed by, grounded in, or responsive to sort of local movements for resistance.
Yeah, and I think Black Lives Matter is an interesting case study for a couple of reasons. It had grounding before the pandemic. That is, its vision was best articulated in 2017 in terms of what the sort of demands of the movement were. So it had a vision already that was ready and sort of willing to go. And that vision met this perceptual shift from other elements of the population. So beyond Black Lives Matter, what we're looking for, as you said, Brooke, are where is this grounded, articulated vision sort of there lying in wait to meet the perceptual shift that happens in a disaster. And that's sort of what we talk about as a vision that is strong enough to maybe overcome the resilient epistemic systems of normalcy.
Yeah, and so part of that is this question of then, what kind of response could you design that would be more open and responsive to those movements that are already on the ground, that are there to sort of offer the aspirational vision that can take hold in the moment of rupture. And so, I mean, yes, we are totally using Black Lives Matter in a US-centric way, in part because we're trying very, very hard to we've been giving this talk in the US, and we've been trying very, very hard to get people to think about these two things as happening in relationship to one another instead of as totally separate entities. But I think that this pattern is something that we can absolutely look for across the globe. I think it is repeated, it is echoed through disasters, and that it plays out much more successfully in places that are not the US, in part because of the dominance of our disciplinary disaster imaginary here.
Yeah, quick follow-up. I think you may actually have two papers there, separable papers. You probably do, and they're each lovely. And then the second little comment is, you might find, just as a shorthand to get to data points that would interest you as you're trying to think globally, the Gender Disaster Network has a lot of concrete examples and then networks people together. So yeah, I think there's a lot of knowledge among feminists about the kind of thing you're looking for, and I'm sure you can tap into it if you haven't already. Thanks very much for a great talk.
Thank you so much.
I was going to just intervene and say, well, in a way, it's great if you could put more of the global perspective into it, but I can quite understand you got 8,000 to 9,000 words, so you're going to have to focus sharply somewhere. I was just thinking that maybe one possible area would draw things together for you is you had that wonderful quote from was it North Carolina, where they said, solidarity doesn't belong to the American ethic, and it has been dropped out. But maybe that's a bit of a clue, really, because I think where there has been cohesive response and some success, you have had solidarity developing, which is a different type of idea from just cooperation. It involves a little bit more. There is I mention it just because another contributor to the volume is Hauke Brunkhorst, and he has actually got a book on solidarity where he kind of argues for it as an ethical standpoint, which would serve us well in the future. Just that point.
Thanks.
Good luck with all that. Garman, any more people want to raise questions?
Not that I've seen. If anyone does, they can correct me.
Yeah, click your microphones and just say something if you'd like to raise a question, or you've got interesting things that have occurred to you in listening to the talk. Is there anyone? I'm sure there would be somebody. People have bit by bit had other things to do and left their thanks. So if I were you, Mitch and Jordan, I'd have a look at the comments after the meeting, because there's some quite nice compliments about a great paper. Yeah, I suppose to continue on the American theme, I mean, Hegel is supposed to have said, you know, that in his time, America was the land of the future, and his view was, you know, the world moved along with dominant points of view, you know, that Geist had got to America eventually, and this is how things move along. So there's an argument from that point of view that, you know, you're setting the tone. At the moment, you're setting the tone. That's the problem as well. If you want to, you know, is Geist moving elsewhere? You know, so that's a question that one could ask. There's a consciousness already that time has been lost and opportunities and economic opportunities are being lost to China. So the American century may peter to an end.
Well, what's been startling to us looking at this politically is that the frameworks are in general nostalgic. And I mentioned that was in disaster legislation. It's always backwards looking to the way it was before. More and more other countries around the globe are writing forward-looking disaster legislation. Let's use the opportunity of the disaster to improve where we were. Because in a disaster, money comes in, there are opportunities for change. Those are explicitly discounted in the American context, but in other places, Senegal, Mongolia, other things like that, South Africa even, they're sort of trying to legislate in ways that are forward-looking. So I think in the American context, we are a bit trapped in the nostalgic view to the past, which is sort of an antithesis of the Geist idea.
Yeah, and I think it's important to name that because of the ways that I think we do tend to still, or Americans still tend to think of themselves as the land of the future, as you put it, Howard. And so I think that it is really important to name the ways, you know, Naomi Klein has this account of disaster capitalism, right? The way in which when a disaster happens, part of what happens is that, you know, property companies, tech companies move in and sort of take over public institutions and remap places in line with capitalism. And this is framed explicitly as a kind of innovation, as a kind of futurism. And we want to argue, no, it's another kind of nostalgia, right? It's another echoing of settler colonial logics. And so I think that that really thinking resistantly against this idea that the American ethic is a futurist ethic at this point is really critical to understanding the United States' place in shaping the global disciplinary disaster imaginary.
Well, the disaster imaginary in Britain, or at least the one that the government has been pressing, is 1940, you know, fighting the Germans alone, which is in itself a disaster, you know, because, and I think it's wearing very thin because they realize they're just not, there is no comparison, and they are at the center of the very poor comparison as well. They just haven't got a clue. So, yeah, it's really excellent the way that you're trying to kind of put together from what's happening a positive vision, and I wish you well with it. Any other comments?
Yeah, I've just seen Andrew Vincent put his hands up, so he can have the last question, I think.
Oh, this is going to be tricky, I warn you, Jordan.
No.
You've done all right.
It was very interesting. I just a few kind of questions, which are kind of linked in a way. I haven't really kind of worked through them yet. I suppose that the first question is, as regards disaster, is there a temporal factor? So, because some, you know, the sense that, you know, how long something actually takes place as to whether it's going to be characterized as a disaster or not, that's a fairly kind of minor thing. I suppose a second question is, how far is it important where people might define something away? I suppose I was thinking there of Bolsonaro, who, you know, characterized COVID as just a slightly unpleasant flu, and basically said, you know, people are taking this all too seriously. It doesn't really exist. A little bit Trumpian in a kind of odd way. He's kind of Trump kind of subclass, isn't he? And of course, the interesting, I was reading last week in a foreign news reporting that his actual popularity has absolutely massively increased, and that you know, he's even with, partly because he's actually, I think he's increased things like family allowance and various other things, so people actually quite like that. But in a way, he's kind of defined it away for himself. I suppose the third element, which actually is relevant to Trump and Bolsonaro and Boris Johnson, amongst others, and that is that there is a kind of underlying what one might call slightly more optimistic tone in the way you've analysed this, and notions like solidarity and local kind of links and so on. I just wonder about something like, say, the tendencies that you see, particularly in populist movements. You could see it in Hungary, you could see it in Turkey, you could see it in America, you can see it in Britain, you can see it in Brazil, and so on and so on. And that is, probably more so in China than anything, and that is that the solution to the disaster, in a way, is to increase authoritarianism of form and centralization, and kind of diminishing the effect, the local kind of responses to it. I mean, you can see it in Britain, for example. One of the big arguments that's going on at the moment is that a number of local regions, like Manchester, in a big city in the north of England, basically, amongst others, wanted to take the initiative in distributing resources and to negotiate with the government. And the response of the government yesterday was to say, basically, how shall I put it? Piss off. Go to hell. We will, if you don't, you haven't actually agreed with us, so we simply will impose what we want on you, which is a kind of minor form, I suppose, what China and Turkey and a whole range of other regimes have been doing across the world. So I suppose that it does generate a certain degree of kind of skepticism about the more optimistic kind of response that might be made. In fact, you know, it's kind of almost a recolonialization, a re-imperial. I mean, China is becoming the new imperialist of all in some ways. And so, yeah, I wonder how that kind of plays into your argumentation. Sorry, it may be a bit pessimistic and cynical, but.
I'll take a stab first. So I think that for us, the disaster imaginary is this disciplinary tactic, which does increase authoritarianism, right? It is, you know, we imagine disasters as like the road warrior sort of situations, partly because it serves the authoritarian interests well to do that. The more that we think that disasters will put us in states of chaos, the more we are willing to give authoritarian governments more power to impose measures that will keep us safe. And so that's why it's so important for us to kind of reframe that framework, because it does lead to more authoritarian impulses. We see that after disasters. After disaster, you will move in one of two ways as a political society. You will move towards a new future, or you will move towards a more authoritarian state.
Forgive me, I came in a little bit late because of confusion in my.
Oh.
I don't know if you actually argued that earlier, because I may have missed it. But,
it's good to. I mean, it's an important point. Do you want to do the?
Well, I think to that, I mean, you know, to your point about the temporality, the pandemic is a really useful place to do this, to think about this, because it is going on for so long, right? It is stretching out. So we get to see disaster playing out over time in a way that when we have more immediate ruptures, right, like an earthquake, like a hurricane, we don't get to see all of the stages stretched out like this over time. They all happen in a very immediate kind of fashion. So we get to do this dissection. And I do think that part of what we're seeing then is the ways in which various regimes, and I think we want to talk about Trump and Bolsonaro in this, but I think we also want to talk about the ways in which more institutional democratic orders are thinking about this, right? The way in which, I think a little bit about Agamben here, right? Like the idea of a state of exception, right? Treating the disaster as a state of exception that proves the necessity of the institutional order that will reassert itself on the other side. And within the American context, we think about this as both the Hobbesian move, right, the kind of authoritarian militaristic move, but also the Lockean move of assuring through things like the Stafford Act that property owners' rights will be protected, that we will reassert the kind of existing property relations as a central piece of what it means to reestablish order. So Jacob Remies has a great paper on this where he does this analysis about the Chilean earthquake, and he looks at sort of the three different movements of the government in conceptualizing what the earthquake was in order to justify the political regime that they were asserting through their disaster response. So I know that we're out of time, but I mean, the answer is sort of yes. And so part of why we're really interested in this idea of the disaster imaginary as a tool of epistemological discipline is that we really want to destabilize what disasters are so that we can understand them as disciplinary frameworks for organizing how we know and how we know collectively under different political regimes, so that disasters become a way of accelerating what those political regimes were sort of aiming to do anyway. If that makes sense.
Okay, I think we're going to have to stop because some people have got, we've actually, Gamal and I have got another appointment with another set of conference. But that was I think this, the talk spoke for itself. I don't really need to compliment you. It went brilliantly, a brilliant start. And I think it's very hopeful for our future sessions. I think the next one is going to be in a fortnight's time with Georg Kavaler talking about the Westphalian system. Georg did tune in earlier, but he's at the University of Vienna. And after that, Sylvie will be talking about modern sovereignty on I think it's like the 12th, the dates, all that kind of thing we'll let you know about. But really, thank you very much. Thanks, Garmon, for all the work that you've done getting this together. And thanks very much for Jordan and Mitch for really, really stimulating talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure many others did as well. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. We really, really enjoyed it. Thank you all for your comments.
Brilliant.
Thanks.
Brilliant.